We can do a reflection on the Dhamma. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Saṅghāṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Saṅghāṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Saṅghāṃ saranang gacchāmi. So, nice to see everybody here on Christmas Day. Kind of a big holiday in Canada. Now it's kind of internet-based, so probably not sure everybody watching is in Canada, but here in Canada, this is a big holiday. Big holiday in the States, big holiday in Europe, and pretty much all the countries that have this kind of traditional Christian background. Kind of in each of the religions, the great religions in the world, each of their kind of founders' birthday, or sometimes a significant day associated with their life, but often their birthday, I think, is celebrated. It's kind of one of the biggest holidays in that particular country. I'm not sure if I'm not too familiar actually with the Muslim holidays, but I imagine they overlap a bit. Have similar holidays around events in their founder's life. And this is traditionally the kind of the focus of a society. And kind of the society's focus traditionally tends to be around these people who have done great things for us. Yeah? And so it's interesting, I remember going to Thailand, even the calendar was based on the Buddhist. Here it's the year 2018, or still 18, okay, yeah, I'm checking. Still 2018. There it's like the year 2500, and because it counts back from the time of the Buddha, And, our time, the what they call the Common Era now, used to be called the Christian Era, actually dates from time of Jesus' life, And I'm not too sure if, I don't know if the Muslims, they have another calendar, but all these things, they show that these kind of societies were traditionally focused on the lives of these people. It's kind of not the first emperor of their country, not the greatest scientist, but these people who were the founders of their religions. And these were seen as the kind of things that glued these societies together. And this is actually a very kind of important thing. Kind of the things that actually glue people together, that make people's lives in a given society good, are not necessarily the kind of conquests of that society. They're not necessarily the material achievements of that society, although these things are kind of important. But at their basis, at the very base, are these kind of wholesome principles that tend to cut across actually pretty much all the various religions, So I remember when I was, before I became a Buddhist, I was a kind of secular humanist, but not a humanist, just secular, just out for whatever I could grab from the world, And I had a very kind of negative attitude towards religion in general. Actually, I thought it was pretty much superstition. I thought that any religion was more or less superstition. And that it was kind of, Karl Marx has this kind of phrase that religion is the opiate of the masses. In other words, people who are too weak-minded to accept that nothing happens to us after death, all there is the here and now, all there is material things, they need a religion to help them cope with the various difficulties that come into their life. But somebody who's intellectually strong, somebody who is independent, that type of person can live their life fearlessly, not needing an external source like a religion to tell them how to gain their happiness. The happiness they gain is all in their effort to get stuff. Happiness they gain is in their success to manipulate the material world around them to give them what they want, you know? And so this was a kind of a way that, that I personally lived my life, and that many of the friends that I had lived their lives. Religion at this time was kind of a token thing, kind of. Maybe you do the odd thing, if there was a big feast, everybody would say amen after a prayer, but that was pretty much the extent of our religious involvement. Mostly it was what they call secular. It's kind of out for sensual pleasures. But the irony of all this was that these kind of sensual pleasures are not things that are really inherently satisfying. Kind of often talk about this in the meditation class, but kind of now is a very kind of wealthy time. It's an incredibly wealthy time, really. When you think about it right here, we're sitting on Christmas in the middle of the winter, getting towards the middle of the winter. It's very cold, but we're actually in a 21-degree room, and I have no hat on, and I'm not stoking any fire. Nobody's stoking a fire. And if it goes below 21 degrees, it automatically kicks in, and the heater comes on until it reaches 21 degrees. And if I don't like it at 21 degrees, I can set it higher, or lower. Could have the room theoretically. I don't think I would do it, but I don't think Nayaka Hamuro would approve. But theoretically, the room could go to 30 degrees. And if you wanted to, it could be summer in the middle of winter, and you wouldn't have to lift a finger. And this is this kind of achievement of what they call kind of secularism. Kind of, it doesn't need a religious base. We don't need a religious basis to achieve these things. Don't need a religious basis necessarily to create these technologies that allow us to gain these things. And it's not a bad thing to have. In fact, I've lived in places where I've had to stoke fires, and I prefer the thermostat. You're going to have to stoke that fire, and things get really hot, and you're okay, things are good, and then it starts to get cold. You got to go stoke this fire again. Sometimes right before you sleep, you make this fire really, really hot. And then you fall asleep. When you wake up in the morning, it's down to 0 again. So you can see why kind of having these thermostats is a really good thing. But the thing about this is that what the Buddha says is that even if, the sky rained gold coins, still we would not be able to keep up with our sensual desires. Still, there would never be any satisfaction. And they call this kind of secularism. Again, I'm not trying to knock secular. I like having the thermostat. It's pretty good, But this kind of secular aspect of the way that people live their life needs to be balanced with what we might call the spiritual aspect, In other words, there's things that we can, with our intellect, predict. There's things that we can plan for. There's things that we can manipulate. There's things that we can do to make the world around us submit and obey, our desires. We can form it in the image of our desires. There's a certain extent to which this is possible. But there's also a certain uncertainty in people's ability to do this. It's never a certain thing. And so no matter what the success of secularism is, when somebody's purely secular, underneath it all is this uncertainty. When we study the history of whatever secular country it is, whatever invention, whatever mode of thinking, all these things tend to go through cycles. All empires go through a cycle where they rise, they're stable, and they fall. And when we really examine the interesting thing about what tends to precede their rise, what tends to happen when they're stable, and what tends to happen when they fall, it might be what we call these things kind of spiritual things. I got really interested one time in the Roman Empire, kind of when I was young, and started studying the kind of Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was really interesting, actually. They were they had to compete with some like very strong alternative empires, especially this one empire called Carthage. You guys might have heard of this Carthage. So they still have this city in Spain called Cartagena that was found by the Carthaginians. And there was this time Rome was expanding and they were taking over these Greek city-states, and their competitor was this place called Carthage. I think they came from the Middle East, these Carthaginians. And these Carthaginians, they were pretty strong too. Both Rome and Carthage were these seafaring nations. Both were on the Mediterranean, which was center of culture at that time. And both were competing. And it's uncertain which way it would have gone. So Rome at this time had these things called these virtues. They had this virtue that they called fides, or like fidelity. They had all these very strong ideas of what we might call like martial virtues. They had this kind of strong ideas of of these different things. And there was a time when they were actually almost conquered by this general Hannibal. Hannibal kind of came up through Carthage, came down through the mountains, and actually went into Rome and killed almost all of their senior officers. And it was this one officer, Scipio Africanus, who rallied all these, what remained of the Roman Empire. Basically, all of it got conquered, like a lot of their territory, almost all of it got lost, except the city of Rome. And this general Hannibal was just there looting the countryside, and probably could have, Rome was hanging by a finger thread. He could have captured Rome if he just hung around there, but he got the order from Carthage to come back. So then this general Scipio Africanus was able to rally the Roman troops from like almost nothing. And actually from this rallying, he was able to take back all that Rome had lost. And then from there, he actually sailed to Carthage, to Africa, and he conquered Carthage, which is actually an amazing feat, coming back from nothing. That was at the beginning of the Roman Empire. And they had these incredible sense of duty and honor towards one another, an incredible sense of putting forth effort, an incredible sense of sacrifice, which was actually what gave them the momentum to do this, which is what allowed Scipio Africanus to come back from such a terrible defeat. And the funny thing was, at the end of the Roman Empire, when you ever study the end, they became very, very rich. They became basically a superpower. They had all these, they had a military technology that surpassed everybody else's military technology. They were the first ones to build roads everywhere, which allowed them to maintain this huge empire. They had discipline standards of military engagement, and so they were able to train huge forces of like 20,000 men. And at the end, they got really conceited about that. Actually, eventually, Rome started to get called the Eternal City. In other words, this is a city that kind of never ends. It just keeps going. The Roman Empire will last forever. This is what everybody thought. And they got pretty lazy. Once they started to get conceited, they started getting lazy. And the politics in Rome got more and more corrupt, increasingly corrupt, to the point where it was just taken for granted that politicians were corrupt. And then the things that the Romans started to do became increasingly weird. Like if you study the end of the Roman Empire, the things they did for entertainment were really kind of strange and evil. These kind of terrible acts of evil that people would gather in the Colosseum and watch, And so they did this for fun. And so eventually their kind of moral virtue declined. And what had happened in the meantime was the barbarians had taken on their military values, and they came to Rome and they wanted to join the Roman Empire. It was this was at the very end of the Roman Empire. But they'd become so conceited and degenerate, they wouldn't let them join, And so these barbarians had a superior force, but they just became so conceited, they kept trying to attack these barbarians. And so eventually these barbarians sacked the city of Rome. And that was the kind of thing that shocked the ancient world and took Europe into the Dark Ages. When we study these kind of things, when we watch them historically, this kind of secularism only went so far. This secularism, the ability to manipulate these external conditions, was dependent for the Romans on their virtue. When their virtue fell away, the momentum of the society that they created kept going for a while, but when it was gone, they could not rally back. Even against a barbarian force that didn't even, was not even close to as rich as them. At the beginning of the Roman Empire, they were able to endure terrible acts of torment, almost the destruction of their whole empire. And so this is what we see. In other words, the secular success that a nation has, that a person has, this success is actually dependent to a certain extent on their morality, on their spirituality. These things need to go hand in hand, which is why it's wise that in all these countries, the birth of the founders of these religions is taken to be a great event. These various lives of their founders is taken to be a great event. Because the founders of these things represent something. They represent more than just this kind of grasping at whatever material object it is. They represent, all these great religions represent a kind of a happiness that comes from things we might call more spiritual. It doesn't come from getting, it comes from virtues like giving. It comes from virtues like respecting one's elders, respecting one's parents. It comes from virtues like chipping in. Everybody doing a little bit to make something greater. This is kind of virtue of what you might call self-sacrifice. Comes from virtues like enduring difficulties. When times get rough, we endure them. We keep going with this faith that things will get better if we do good actions. And all these things are what allow a society to build up. But when a society reaches its apex, it's easy to forget them. It's like when people, you often see this in these kind of biographies of people, like movies about people who get really rich and famous. Before they're rich and famous, they have this kind of group of friends or group of people who are really good to them, and they're really good to. And they get more and more famous, and all these other people come around who are real charming, And what eventually happens to these people is they hang out with these people who are real charming, who are always giving them something. Often it's drugs in these movies, giving them drugs, giving them various kinds of sensual pleasure. And the people who were there for them through the tough times fall away. And then what happens is when their fame goes, all these people who came around and were so charming, they disappear. And that person is left with nothing. That's this kind of typical like Hollywood story that you'll tend to see. It's kind of hankering after their fame. So the important thing here is that these virtues are like these good friends. These virtues are things that are common to every religion. Of course, religions have their differences, There's no question about that, and it's good to evaluate them to make informed choices. But these virtues that are common, these are the things that give our life a direction, They're the things that give our life a stability. Virtues like giving, virtues like being restrained in morality, not killing, not lying, not stealing, not engaging in improper, for one not to engage in improper relationships, and not taking intoxicants. All these things, lying, killing, stealing, improper relationships, and intoxicants, they're like these kind of friends that come around once you start to get rich. It's hard to do a lot of killing when you're not powerful. Hard to do a lot of stealing and plundering of other countries and other people when you're not powerful. When you're not powerful, not a lot of people of the opposite, not a lot of men or women are going to come around. When you're not powerful, liquor and drugs get pretty expensive. When you become powerful and rich, suddenly all these things show up. And it's easy to forget that power and wealth were built by abstaining from them, by doing these good things. So regardless of what religious holiday it is, regardless of whether it's a Christian holiday today like Christmas, regardless of whether it's a Muslim holiday like Ramadan, where they kind of fast to remember the poor, regardless of whether it's Vesak, where we commemorate the Buddha's birth, death, and enlightenment, these virtues are good at all times, for all people, in all religions. Regardless of our religious affiliation, regardless of our holiday, these things make our life happy. These things make our life bright. And so it's good to keep these things in mind, not just on a religious holiday, but every day. And in that way, I used to have this kind of, senior monk, he'd say, every day is a holy day. Because I think that's where holiday comes from, like holy day. So if we keep these virtues in mind, every day will be a holy day, holiday. Every day will be Christmas. Okay? So I think I'll leave that for reflection.